Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. You can find out more about FFF at our website at fff.org. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to be back after the holiday weekend, and I appreciate our viewers and listeners spending a little bit of their time with us.
Yeah, I thought we would discuss a controversy that's taking place in the National Football League, specifically the controversy over the National Anthem. As you know, during the past year, there have been some African American players that were protesting police brutality of African Americans by kneeling during the National Anthem. And this caused a tremendous, outcry from the right wing that was accusing these people of being unpatriotic or treasonous for daring to not stand during the National Anthem. And so the NFL has come out now with a new rule that prohibits kneeling, and they're going to permit players to, I guess, stay in the locker room during the National Anthem, something like that. And so it's not real clear how all this is going to play out in the upcoming season, but clearly they were losing attendance at NFL games, and the NFL is trying to figure out some solution to this. And of course, there's people on the left saying, violating free speech rights and so forth, which is ridiculous because free speech only comes in the context of government controls and government censorship, and the NFL is a purely private organization that, as you know, under libertarian principles, Richard, is free to set any conditions it wants for the operation of its league. But I want to throw out an idea here, which I think is a much better solution than the NFL's solution, and that is, why not just cancel the National Anthem at sporting events? And for that matter, why not cancel all the militarism at sporting events? The generals and the colonels that come out and participate in these sporting events. And my question, Richard, is what purpose is there to have all this nationalism and militarism at sporting events? I mean, sporting events are like sports. That's what they're about. Why not limit them to sports? I mean, when we've got other activities, like church events, we limit those to church matters. Why do we need this national anthem, or why do we need the militarism and all the soldiers at sporting events? So I know you've written a lot about nationalism in the past, and of course, having known you a long time, Richard, I know that you hate America and you love communism, and so I'd be particularly interested in your take on this proposal of mine.
Comrade, you've released my secret. You've outed me. Oh, God, now Kremlin will no longer pay me. You are a sick human being. Viewers and listeners, this is a very sick person. You see what I have to put up with? And every week.
Well, isn't that the standard response when you make a suggestion like this? Oh, you must hate America. Oh, you must be a communist sympathizer. People can't think in terms, especially people in the right wing, cannot think in terms of principles of like, hey, what do we need nationalism for at a sporting event? Why is that necessary? Why do we need the militarism? Why do those generals have to be there? Why do people have to be exhorted to stand up and thank the troops for their service defending our rights and freedoms, especially when they're not defending our rights and freedoms in all these overseas adventures, because nobody over there that they're killing is threatening to take away our rights and freedoms? Why not just limit sports to sports, Richard? That's what I'm suggesting here.
Right. It clearly has been developing for many, many decades now, that somehow these public events, whether it be baseball, football, or any of the other, especially group sports, that the game is preceded by everyone standing and the playing of the national anthem. That really rhythmic toe tapper that we all easily sing. And why? It's clearly meant to be an element of trying to arouse a sense of patriotism and nationalist loyalty to the country. And this, in fact, is in many ways plays into those. And this is across the political spectrum, because it's true that there are some on the left who for their own reasons, sometimes criticize this. But basically, in terms of the vast middle of the left and the right, Republicans and Democrats, there's a strong consensus that we're all in it together. We must be proud to be Americans. We must show our nationalist support and endorsement and a public symbolism of it. But why? The fact is that when I have guests over to my house, or we've had sort of like parties in our backyard, we don't start the festivities before I hand out the brats and the burgers that I've prepared on the grill, by all of us trying to sing the Star-Spangled Banner. But let me sort of get back to an element that really is more general. The nationalist element is important, and we should emphasize and discuss why this is taken to be necessary. But let's take it back to the other point you raised, and this is the private sector versus government mandate. Any private organization or association has a right to set the rules that it wants. Now, if the National Football League found that because their attendees or the viewers on television had a sympathy of patriotism and wanted or made them feel good to stand up and for the national anthem before the start of the game, then that's the right of a private group. It's also the case that a private organization, such as a sport team or sport association, has the right to not have the national anthem at the beginning of their games. And in addition, the fact is that the NFL players are under contract with the association and specifically the teams that employ them. And those contracts can specify the forms of conduct, demeanor, behavior that is expected of employees in the public. If you work for the Coca-Cola bottling company, that company could perhaps penalize you or even end your employment if you chose to stand outside of the Coca-Cola bottling factory and say Coke stinks and everybody should drink Pepsi. And certainly if they did that on the company's grounds. So the fact is, it's a matter of contractual agreement. If the players wish to be able to make a public statement in a setting in which the sports league or the individual teams choose to have the national anthem and they don't agree with it, then that's a negotiating arrangement that they make privately. But what has been happening is that this bit has been politicized in a way that it shouldn't be. These matters that I'm referring to are the matters of the private sector. The same way as if you work in a shoe store in the mall, the shoe store owner might very well require of you a code of dress, not to come in a T-shirt and torn jeans, casual business or a jacket and a tie, and that's the appearance they want to create to attract a certain clientele. You either accept that or you don't, and you go to work someplace else. So at the one level, these are private matters that should not be politicized. It should not be used as a football for political agendas by either the left or the right, which they do, and would if it was just recognized as a matter of private affairs rather than, oh, this is concerning one's spirit and appreciation and loyalty and support for the country. And that gets back to the other point, and that is the politicization of sports. Now, it is true, Jacob, that if you go back to the ancient of the Olympics, for example, thousands of years ago, the sporting events were meant to be a way of demonstrating one's prowess and agilities and abilities in sporting activities that had the connection with one's ability to fight, a city-state versus another city-state. And therefore, it was sort of like the disarming of combat for pleasure of the sporting. But that's a long time ago. And what has happened now is that governments have co-opted this. especially in the United States, though not only in the United States, but especially is that these events are meant to be public demonstrations. Now, again, if a private sporting association wishes to have a general come out, like sometimes the president does, and throw out the first ball of the World Series, that's their private matter. They're responding to what their consumers may or may not want or care about. But the politicization of it to serve sort of a national loyalty, it's like a litmus test. By golly, this fellow sitting next to me in the bleachers, he didn't stand up for the national anthem. He should be subject to ostracism. He's unpatriotic. He's un-American. Maybe he should be reported to the Department of Homeland Security. Maybe only a terrorist would choose not to stand during the national anthem. This creates even though I'm making an extreme case there, the point is this creates an atmosphere of antagonism, conflict, tension, and a sense that a person feels obligated to have to do something even if they don't want to. Now, in the Soviet Union, it was compulsory for everyone to go periodically to voluntary demonstrations organized by the Communist Party. Now, if you didn't show up, obviously there were greater consequences than not standing during the national anthem in a football stadium. But the fact is, it's the same psychology you see. You're demonstrating loyalty, obedience. You're with us and not against us. And therefore raises the issue of, well, what is patriotism? What is loyalty? What does it mean to be an American and what the principles stand for? And therefore it's politicized to a particular conception of what it is. Pro-American, supporting the troops, waving the flag, America, right or wrong, my country can never do wrong, et cetera, et cetera. And this type of psychology, political psychology and environment, is not often reflected or thought about, but shouldn't be ignored. It's the solidifying of loyalty to the state.
Yeah, I think one of the big problems involved in all this is the conflation of the country with the government in people's minds.
Yes.
That all this nationalism causes people to think of America as one great big entity that consists of both the federal government and the private sector. Well, our ancestors, the people who formed this country, who brought the federal government into existence, clearly understood that we're talking about two separate and distinct entities here. We're talking about the private sector, which they refer to as the country, and we're talking about the federal government. And that phenomenon is best reflected by the Bill of Rights, which really should have been called a Bill of Prohibitions because it prohibits the government from suspending, infringing, taking away the freedoms and the rights of the country. But what all this nationalism does is it causes people to just think in terms of one giant entity. And so that if you don't support or don't stand up for the national anthem, or you don't support all this militarism in sporting events, that means you hate America. As compared to just somebody that says, I don't think this belongs here. Now, another interesting facet to this is, and I totally agree with you that, in the private sector, private businesses are free to run their businesses any way they want and set conditions for employees. If employees don't like it, they're free to go elsewhere. There's people that can form other football leagues that operate under different rules. So that's the virtue of competition in a free market. But, my question, Richard, is more fundamental. Why does a nation even have to have a national anthem? In fact, the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, really was not enacted into law till I think 1930 or so, which I find interesting because this was the time when America was shifting towards socialism and imperialism. You've got the Spanish-American War in 1898, which was the real turning point toward empire and interventionism. You've got the intervention in World War I. You've got the socialist ideas that are percolating, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, national health care, public schooling. And so the culmination, of course, is in the 1930s with the transformation of America's economic system to a welfare state, and then the 1950s to a national security state. And I find it interesting that the national anthem is enacted into law by Congress right around this time, right before the Roosevelt administration and the New Deal. Now, this means that for more than 100 years, Americans lived without a national anthem. Does that mean that 19th century Americans hated America and couldn't stand what the country stood for? No, it's that they didn't think in these kind of terms. They thought in terms of, with the exception of slavery, which is a pretty big violation, well, the biggest violation of liberty you could ever find. But they just thought in terms of, living their lives the way they wanted, and deciding how to pursue happiness in their own way. They didn't think in terms of, I want a great nation. All they thought in terms of is, how can I live my life the way that is best suitable for my own individual happiness? And so you had this unique society, a very unusual society, especially after slavery's over. You've got a society with no income tax, no IRS, no DEA, no drug laws, no immigration controls, no Federal Reserve System, no paper money. They had gold and silver coins as the official money of the country, no gun control, and no national anthem. And yet, they considered themselves living in a free country, in a very prosperous country. There was tremendous prosperity here. The most charitable nation in history was around this time when people were free to accumulate wealth. They gave a lot of it away. So that's totally different from the concept that we're now under, where you have the government says, well, no, that's not to say that people didn't sing songs at events. Sometimes they do, My Country 'Tis of Thee, or America the Beautiful, and whatever they felt like singing, they would sing. But there wasn't this official anthem that Congress enacts into law, which, by the way, totalitarian regimes do. I mean, if you look at the big totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, they had national anthems, and they had militarism and praising the troops. And our American ancestors, as you know, there was a tremendous antipathy toward militarism, toward big standing military establishments. That's why there was no CIA either during this period of time, no NSA, no big standing military establishment. The size of the army was relatively small. So it was a totally different way of life. But if you look at 19th century Americans, I mean, they would consider themselves patriots for being against all of the nationalism and militarism that was characterizing the British Empire and other totalitarian, authoritarian regimes. So I think that's an important factor to consider here is, what is the concept of patriotism? What does it mean? Does it mean nationalism? I think it's something completely different.
Well, let's remember what nationalism often entails. Particularly as the concept. First of all, let me step back, if I may, for a moment. The concept of nationalism, as we understand it, an identity with a particular geographical area or with a particular cultural or linguistic group, this is only about 300 years old. It emerged in its modern form with the French Revolution. Before that, you had loyalties to your community. If you were a peasant, you had a traditionalist of service and obedience to the lord of the manor, of course to the church because of the pervasiveness first of the Catholic Church and then Protestant denominations after the Reformation. But loyalties and a sense of, quote, patriotism often were just very localized. But with the end of the monarchy in France during the French Revolution, what do you substitute loyalty and obedience to the king with? And immediately the French revolutionists came up with the idea that the loyalty is to the nation because the nation represents the people. And therefore the sacrifices, the obedience that was once expected from you in the service of the king, who was viewed as divine, been given his power by God. He in principle owns the entire area that over which he reigns, including the people. Now you merely substituted that for the collective of people. That sense of nationalism emerged and then became this dynamic force in the 19th and now into the 20th and beyond centuries. And it's the idea that the nation, the collective, defined by a geographical area, a cultural heritage, a language, sometimes a religion of a national identification, that these now transcend the interests, the purposes, the goals, and even the freedom of the individual. You are to sacrifice for the nation. The nation comes before you, your family, and any surrounding community that you feel a born loyalty to. It's basically collectivism, the group over the individual, the tribe over the person. And this idea of a symbolizing of this, the flag, right? Then you follow the flag guides you. The Pledge of Allegiance, which was written in the 1880s or 1890s, I'm forgetting now, by a socialist, by the way, the idea of national unity for a future socialism. That's basically the origin of the Pledge of Allegiance. They added "and God" in the Pledge of Allegiance only in the 1950s during the Eisenhower administration. That made us different than the commies, the atheist commies. But all this is a sense of I am aligned and I owe my allegiance, my obedience, and even the sacrifice of my life and those I care about, if necessary, to the nation, the people, the state, and those who declare themselves to be the representatives and the voices of the people through the nation and the state. It is the collectivism and the tribe over the person and the individual. Patriotism is a confusing concept. It has meant what you were talking about, Jacob, in the 19th century. You're proud to be an American because this is a country of freedom. The individual is secure in his rights. He knows that which he has honestly earned will be regarded and recognized as his private property. He freely lives his life peacefully with the neighbors through cultural interests and, of course, through the exchanges of the marketplace. That was the earlier sense of patriotism, the freedom of the individual that the government is established to secure and protect versus the sacrifice of the individual to this higher entity that to which he is to be a sacrificial animal if necessary and called upon to do.
Yeah, your point about the Pledge of Allegiance is great. I mean, it was authored by a socialist, and it has become a real core element of government schooling in America ever since we were kids. I mean, you're expected to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, and of course, they never tell you that it was crafted by a socialist, but it's along these same lines. It's part of that nationalist culture that has been inculcated in the American people from the early part of the 20th century. And if you'll Google Pledge of Allegiance and look at images, you'll see that the kids back early on were doing the Pledge of Allegiance with an outstretched arm. And after World War II, that became, or even in the 30s maybe, it became a little uncomfortable that American school kids were using the same symbol that the Nazi people would use to honor Der Fuhrer. In fact, Nazi Germany is a good example of all this collectivism and nationalism. I mean, this is, people were expected to extol the state, the nation. It was all considered one and the same thing. And in fact, one of the most humorous aspects of the Nazi regime, if there's anything humorous about it, was that when Hitler wrote Roosevelt a letter through, Franklin Roosevelt, a letter through the U.S. ambassador to Germany that said, please communicate to the president that we share the same goals, that he is putting the private interest second to the common interest, to the good of society. And what he was referring, of course, is to Roosevelt's New Deal, which was doing precisely that. It was rejecting everything America had stood for in terms of individualism and liberty and adopting the welfare state, which is the idea of the common good above the individual selfish good of people trying to plan their own lives using their own money. Now, another good example with respect to Nazi Germany was the story of the White Rose, which I wrote about in an essay called "The White Rose: A Lesson in Dissent" many years ago. And here, these young people, college students, led by a brother and sister named Hans and Sophie Scholl, began secretly publishing essays that were critical of the Nazi regime in the midst of World War II. Now, this was heresy. I mean, this is war, support the troops. We're in the middle of war. We have to band together as a nation. And so these young people were viewed as traitors, lack of patriotism. And, of course, I look at them today and I say, no, they were the real patriots because they were willing to have the courage to stand up to what was the wrongdoing of their own government. And I think that's the real defining line between what a genuine patriot is. Today, they refer to patriotism as supporting the troops, supporting the government under this nationalist concept. Well, the real genuine meaning of patriotism, as the White Rose understood, was no, it's the courage to take a stand, even in the midst of war, maybe especially in the midst of war, against the wrongdoing of your own government. And of course, another example of this was the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson, where Gibson is taking a stand. He's a British citizen. He's taking a stand against his own government because of what the military had done to his sons. That's why the title of the movie was The Patriot, and that's why back then people who took a stand against the wrongdoing of their government were considered the patriots, just like the White Rose. I would consider the patriots.
Yes, it's worth keeping in mind in this context. Of course, the fate of those very brave and principled young German students who did this and were captured, as maybe our viewers and listeners haven't read your article and know the story, were eventually captured, put before a kangaroo court, and then brutally murdered, including a beheading. That's a very extreme form, but there have been many instances, tragically, in American history where governments have attempted to silence criticism in the name of the actions being unpatriotic. There were a number of editors and publishers of newspapers in the North after the start of the American Civil War in 1861 who were critical of Lincoln's policies. These newspapers were censored. Editors and publishers were actually arrested and detained for the duration of the war. Fast forward to the First World War, Wilson was president. Anyone who dissented or disagreed with American entry into the war and the American war effort was subject to arrest for treason and imprisoned. In fact, the head of the American Socialist Party, Eugene V. Debs, was in fact arrested and imprisoned for the duration of the war on those very grounds. And there were those who were silenced during the Second World War by the Roosevelt administration. I'm not even referring to the fact that innocent Japanese Americans, never accused of spying on behalf of the Japanese government, were en masse arrested, transported, and detained in what were not much different than a concentration camp in places like Arizona, for instance. So we have carried out these policies of suppression for what is viewed as lack of patriotism, lack of support for the country, right or wrong, that supposedly dissent stops at the water's edge. No, it's precisely when the United States government and those who hold offices in that government proceed to undertake foreign interventions that are not justifiable under the understanding of what government is for, the protection of the citizenry's life, liberty, and property from the aggression of others. Now, that's why you do have a government. You could imagine a situation where the United States was literally attacked by a foreign country. And it is the duty or responsibility of the government to repel that and resist that. The same way as the policeman on his beat on the street is expected, if he can't deter it, to apprehend a suspect and bring him to justice. But it's precisely because the United States government, particularly in the post-World War period, has followed foreign adventures having nothing to do with that original and very clear and delineated function, that it's necessary to question these and to speak out against it as a true patriot, as a true friend of freedom, when there's American adventurisms beyond the 3-mile limit.
Yeah, and another example is during the Cold War, when you had leftist activists, communist activists, like in the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which was an organization that was committed to ending the embargo against Cuba and establishing normal relations with Cuba, or the U.S. Communist Party. I mean, as we now know, the CIA and the FBI were hell-bent on destroying these organizations, infiltrating them, spying on them, keeping secret files on them. How can they justify this in what purports to be a free society? In a genuinely free society, I mean, you and I are libertarians. We don't like communism or socialism, but we would stand for the right of people to advocate these ideas that might be despicable or harmful or destructive, because that's the very nature of a free society, to be able to advocate the ideas that are unpopular or even destructive. So here they were, U.S. officials, going after these people in the same way that the communist regimes were going after pro-capitalist people. Yes. And so they were adopting the methods of the communists here in what purported to be a free country. And look how they treated Vietnam dissidents and protesters as if they were traitors and maybe a communist front, or how they treated Martin Luther King, who, just because he was advocating the civil rights for African Americans, they considered him and were convinced that he was a communist front, the first step in a communist invasion of the United States. There's also the story of Charles Horman and Frank Tarugi, two young American men in Chile during the Chilean coup, where the U.S. Had this violent regime change operation that they instigated down there. And it turns out that U.S. intelligence participated in the execution of Horman and Tarugi. And in Horman's case, it turns out that he had discovered U.S. complicity in the coup, which they were determined to keep secret. But Tarugi, it turns out they were keeping secret files on him back in the United States, because he was an anti-Vietnam War protester and therefore a traitor. And it by all accounts, it looks like that's why they had Tarugi executed, because he wasn't supporting the war effort. Well, this is what goes on once a nation adopts this concept of nationalism and this perverted sense of patriotism. That the real, genuine patriot, it seems to me, Richard, are the libertarians, who take this principled position on liberty, defending the right of people to advocate ideas, even when they're ideas with which libertarians disagree, and standing fast against government infringements and assaults on those liberties, and where government transcends into the dark side. That's when the true patriot rises and says, no, government should not do this, even if government starts retaliating by doing bad things to him. I mean, that to me is the very essence of patriotism.
Yes, it's the hypocrisy is that there have been many instances, especially during the Cold War period, when in the West it would be publicized that there had been courageous people who in some small or great way had protested against, expressed their opposition to communist regimes behind what was called the Iron Curtain. Demonstrators, however few, who publicly went out and stood in Red Square against the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Well, they were immediately swept up by the militia, what they call that's the name they have for the police, or the KGB itself, whisked away to prison and interrogated, sometimes tortured, into the Gulag. And we view them as courageous individuals. Think of the demonstrators in Beijing in June of 1989, who wanted nothing more than greater freedom and what they understood as democracy versus one-party communist rule. They put up their version of a sort of a Chinese imagery of a Statue of Liberty, if you recall. And we view these students as courageous in how the government brutally oppressed them, where hundreds, if not thousands, of these people were killed. And we almost saw it live on TV in the United States, and then the Chinese government cut the connection so you couldn't see them brutally crush the demonstrators and round them up, kill them, imprison them, send them off to the Chinese version of the Gulag. And we view them as patriots. And what were they doing? They were opposing their government's policies. In the case of 1968, a courageous handful of Russians who were opposing Soviet foreign policy, invading and crushing a moderate democratic socialist spirit against Marxian socialism in Czechoslovakia, or those Chinese young people in Beijing in 1989 standing up against their government merely to be able to peacefully have more self-expression and personal freedom. And do we not view them as heroic advocates of freedom in their own lands, opposing bad government policies. So are they traitors or are they patriots? See, that's the issue that we have to ask ourselves in the context. Well, what if a person sincerely opposes the policies of the United States? He's not throwing bombs. He's not carrying out terrorist attacks. He's not, attacking anybody with a gun or a knife on the street like the terrorist wackos, sometimes here and certainly in Europe. He's just demonstrating. He's voicing his opinion. Just one more example, if I may, Jacob. Today in the Wall Street Journal, about how there are increasingly fewer independent newspapers in Turkey because the president of Turkey is solidifying his power, making himself a dictator. He's arrested thousands of college and high school professors accused of treason and unpatriotic opposition to him, and he has closed down a freedom of the press. But there is one or two Turkish newspapers who are, even though they can't get advertisers to pay for space, so they're on a shoestring, they're continuing to speak out against what they view as a domestic usurper of people's freedom in Turkey in various and sundry ways. Are they traitors or are they heroes? Clearly, the Wall Street Journal is hoping that we'll view these members of the Turkish media who are holdouts for freedom of press and the free, peaceful criticism of their government as heroes. So that is true patriotism. Those are the variations of the thing that you were just saying. And I think that we should just look at ourselves in the mirror and judge ourselves by the same standards when we're either criticizing or praising the way we talk about these acts in other lands.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, that's the perverse irony of all this, is that in those countries that you talked about, China, that I talked about, Nazi Germany, the government there looks at the dissidents as traitors, bad people.
Yes.
But Americans over here look at the White Rose and the people at Tiananmen Square as heroes. But over here, the government has the same mindset toward dissidents that the Chinese government has in China and the Nazi Germany, that over here it's different. These are the traitors. So you have to have programs that the CIA had like COINTELPRO, the destruction of the Communist Party and so forth. And they don't see the perverse irony in all this, that their mindset is no different. It's funny that you mentioned Turkey because the United States and the American people are duty-bound to come to Turkey's aid in the event of a war against Turkey because of NATO. So here you have the perverse irony of maybe going to war to protect dictatorship under the concept of freedom. And let me add one more thing about the White Rose. If you haven't heard about the White Rose, it's a fantastic story. Take a look at my essay, The White Rose: A Lesson in Dissent. There's a lot of good stuff on the internet too, but especially watch a movie. It's a German movie, fantastic movie, called Sophie Scholl, The Final Days. And pay particular attention to the courtroom scene, because when you see this young lady standing up against these tribunal judges, you'll understand it perfectly what we're talking about, because the tribunal judges accuse her of being a bad German, a bad citizen who wasn't raised properly, and then watch the courage of this young woman stand up against these tyrants. Richard, on that note, got to wrap it up. We're out of time. Always a pleasure. Enjoyed it this week as always.
Until next week, and like I always do, because I sincerely mean, I want to thank the viewers and listeners who have shared a little bit of their time with us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all very much for tuning in and for your comments and your support. We've received some nice donations from viewers. We're very, very grateful for that. And look forward to seeing you all next week. Come and visit us at fff.org. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us at fff.org or to me personally at jhornberger@fff.org. Thank you very much, and we'll see you all next week.